Wow. 13 years since release. Kingdom Hearts 2, in a lot of ways, is what a great game sequel looks and feels like, while at the same time taking a few steps back in certain areas. Partially due to not expecting the splash the first game made, especially here in America.
To be honest, I didn't think that it was going to be as big as what has become to be this day. And also what I'm surprised is with the acceptance and the reaction in the North American market compared to Japan. To be honest, it's more it's well received in the States, and it's sold more. So that is
filling in the blanks of the secret ending in the original Kingdom Hearts without a plan. And the big one being that they decided to make a GBA game a mid-quel after assumedly deciding what to do with the actual sequel. I try to keep these videos as spoiler-free as possible because I want viewers to go into the games with an open mind while knowing what they need to know about the gameplay. So for the sake of this video, I'll be discussing whatever plot details in a more practical manner. In the case of Chain of Memories, it officially introduces Organization 13 into the mix, Enigmatic Man notwithstanding. Sora and the gang lose their memories in Chain of Memories so that Nomura can give them new abilities for this game, and Riku starts a redemption arc. And despite my tone describing this game, it's still worth playing in either the original GBA form or the PS2 version including the HD collections. Now we could get into Kingdom Hearts 2. The game starts like a reverse Metal Gear Solid 2. Almost 1 year after Chain of Memories, the game opens with a new character, Roxas, on his last few days of summer vacation with his friends, and things take a turn for him when strange dreams seep in, along with familiar faces from Chain of Memories. Unfortunately, despite its premise, it doesn't hook the player into the game as effectively as the first game did, despite some callbacks in Day 3. Partly because, with the exception of a couple of pre-release screenshots, cover art, and a tease at the end of Chain of Memories, there was little to nothing to go on for people who did follow the series. And for those that didn't, they probably skipped out on Chain of Memories. Many assumed it was a recap of the original game, seeing how the commercials used cutscenes and worlds from the first game. It also doesn't help that the first 2 days are the worst of it. After fighting a regular enemy on day 1, look forward to odd jobs the next day. Most of all of them aren't that great. They pay close to pennies for what the optional goal is, which is automatically filled when the player tries all 3 at least once. It's not until day 3 when things start coming at an interesting pace with the characters from Chain of Memories showing up to fill in the blanks. The point I'm trying to get at is that it doesn't start off on the best foot. And the ironic thing is that Nomura and the team really believed in this part of the game, and was surprised and a little disheartened to hear people quit at day 2 or 3. Much like when MGS2 came out and the negative backlash from fans that came afterwards. Except of course in MGS2, Raiden took center stage. And MGS2 got much more critical acclaim for his decision years later after re-evaluation. And even replaying the sequence now, I can appreciate the intentions and aspirations it was trying to reach, and I also appreciate how Roxas' subtle animations reflect Sora's animations from the first game. But to this day, it still feels like a slog. All it leaves me now is just questioning what if 358 over 2 days came up before this, where a lot of Roxas' character and relationships were explored, which is why I can assume they put it in front of Kingdom Hearts 2 in the HD collections. When Sora gets back into the player character seat is where the plot gets going. Thinking they saved the universe after the events of the first game, they set out to find their friends to return home this time. However, the situation gets complicated whenever a new group of enemies, the Nobodies, think of them as the opposite of the Heartless, and Organization 13 gets involved. If the first game was a fish out of water story, this is a fish trying to get back into water story. And despite the cracks I made at the Roxas segment, it does have a point to it later down the line. Story-wise, there are other problems. I said in the first game, Disney Worlds felt integral to the story because they were involved in the main plot and were more concerned with the game's original story rather than retelling the movies. And whenever they did retell, they fitted in to where it would work in the story Nomura was trying to tell. This was because the first game had a much more dire tone. In the sequel, the tone is much more relaxed due to the end of the original game. Most of the worlds require 2 visits. The first visit is usually the retelling, and the second is where the elements outside the movies come in. There's little to no sense of story progression in the retelling portions, and when you get to the original stuff, some of them are interesting in concept, varying from great to wasted potential. And even then, it doesn't usually progress the story either. Most of the story progression happens in the background or in non-Disney Square Enix original worlds. There are exceptions. Olympus Coliseum tells its own story with both visits, along with having hands down the best integration of any Final Fantasy character in this crossover. Beast Castle carries elements from the film, but there's no Gaston or anything else from the movie other than the Rose. The world antagonist is a specific member of the organization trying to do his own thing in the world. It almost feels like something out of the first game. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that this was also the point of the franchise where the writing would get a lot of the jokes and memes and repeating word drinking games that the series would be associated with.
Heartless, the heartless.
Heartless?
Heart,
Heart?
darkness, darkness, darkness.
What are you calling punks? It's Sora, Donald, and Goofy to you.
Sora? Donald? Goofy?
Sora.
Donald?
Goofy!
Got it memorized?
And as much as I love the individual members of the organization, even the lackluster ones, they never really fleshed them out further until future games. And I know that having them underdeveloped was the goal at this point in the franchise's history, but it's noticeable. I may make it sound like the story is a slog, and yeah, some of it is, but there are some of the best and memorable moments in the series, and it's still enjoyable in spite of the aforementioned flaws. Unlike the story, though, the combat has vastly improved over the original. Nomura wanted to do everything he could to show that Sora had grown from the first game, to his animations, to his combos, to even his character model size when wearing Kingdom Hearts 1 clothes. For example, one of his starter combos in KH2 was an equipable combo extender in KH1. A lot of this can be felt when visiting the old areas through the zoomed out camera and moving at a slightly faster speed than the original game. Armor and accessories are separate entities now and carry much more value than they did before. They're much more easier to use and give the player many options for customization, something that's a necessity on the higher difficulties. Not to mention all the new tools and combat opportunities the player is given in this game. A lot of these new tools and mechanics address almost all the complaints I had in the first game. Physical attacks and magic can be chained more easily. You got regular combos, summons, limit breaks, and drive forms, which gives Sora exclusive combos and abilities for a limited time at the cost of a party member. There's now a point to having world-exclusive Disney characters in your party for the limit breaks and certain tactical advantages. Summons are great for specific situations and can be pretty overpowered if you use them in a certain way. Reaction commands, which can be pretty handy. Drive forms are great for getting out of really desperate situations, though abuse it too much and you get any form, which you can't revert out of, can't use magic, can't heal, or anything but dodge and attack, and it is the worst. And the beauty of all these tools is that they don't overpower each other. You use it and you lose something in return. With drive forms, yeah, it refills your health and magic points. You can't guard unless you have limit form, but even then, it takes away all your magic spells and replaces them with limit breaks. Limit breaks give you invincibility frames and wipes out your MP, leaving you without magic for a few seconds. And summons get rid of allies. And this is on top of potentially leveling up your drives for more abilities. There's just a lot to experiment and play with here. When Kingdom Hearts 2 came out in its original version, it was criticized for being too easy and a lot of the tools ended up not being used. A big part of it is that the game doesn't really teach the player to experiment and try new things. Hitting the attack button and healing all the time will be enough because it works. With few exceptions like Demyx and Zoldan, a lot of the fights in the game never really incentivize the casual player to try something else, or try to think of another strategy, unless you're on critical mode. Critical mode is a Final Mix exclusive mode on the HD collections. HP and MP bonuses are halved and the enemies hit twice as hard, but you get a helping of ability points and abilities to balance things out at the beginning of the game, including 0 experience if you want to be a masochist about it. Running headfirst and hitting things can only get you so far and forces the player to think of strategies and in some cases use every resource they potentially have, especially for the bosses in this mode. The first Kingdom Hearts, with the exception of the super bosses, had one type of boss for the most part. Take a step back, find an opening, rinse and repeat. Super bosses, on the other hand, either amounted to kill it before it kills you like Enigmatic Man and Kurtziza, cautious strategizing like Sephiroth, or tedious repetition like Ice Titan and Phantom. Kingdom Hearts 2 has at least 3 different kinds of bosses. You got your spectacle bosses where reaction commands are the main ways to defeat it. The MCP and Hydra come to mind. The taking a step back bosses, like many in the first one, Barbossa and Demyx are good examples. And the learn by failure bosses, pretty much all the optional bosses, specifically the Data Organization. They're basically tougher versions of organization members with tweaked AI. Then there's Lingering Will. Pretty much the hardest boss in the series that isn't super unfair like future optional bosses. Going back to the first game, I said that there were some bosses where it was okay to lose to. While Kingdom Hearts 2 doesn't do it that way specifically, some bosses have a chance of Mickey Mouse appearing as a playable character to do damage and revive Sora. Again, this makes the player wake up and pay attention, especially in the later bosses. Not for optional bosses for obvious reasons. In the case of the optional bosses, the player still has multiple ways to deal with attack patterns and maneuvering. Each of them has at least 2 different ways of dealing with each attack, whether it be guarding, dodge, reflect, or the get out clause of drive gauges, unless you get anti-form, obviously. And there's a kind of Dark Souls-like quality of dying, try again, get further into the fight, die, then try again, and then eventually victory. There's just so much the player can do, and part of this has to do with what the developers did for the bosses under the hood of the system. Programmer talk coming in. All the bosses have a variable called revenge value. This was found by the Kingdom Hearts 2 speedrunning community. If you want a much more detailed explanation, I recommend Kingdom Hearts 2 speedrunner Bloody Biscuits video on the subject. Basically, it's a value that determines if the boss is going to hit back. If the player is going to keep wailing on the boss, they will eventually hit back, teleport, whatever action they'll do. If the boss hits the player, the revenge value will go down. This tug of war of a value keeps casual players cautious, especially on the higher difficulties, and from spamming. It's simple, but it adds so much. The combat has been pumped up in almost every aspect from the original, but like how all these tools and behaviors cost something, something had to go. Nomura's team was very aware of the non-user-friendly aspects of Kingdom Hearts 1, leading to things like navigational maps and more characters telling you where to go next. But that part isn't the problem though. The problem is the level design. A lot of the worlds in Kingdom Hearts 1, the worlds had kind of a cyclical level design. The first district in Traverse Town led to districts 1 and 3, and vice versa. Wonderland led to the Bizarre Room one way or another. Halloween Town led back to, well, Halloween Town. Level design in Kingdom Hearts 2 are more like tree branches. There are different paths, but very few of them cross over. Coupled with less cleverly hid treasure chests and less openness, it's much less of a joy to explore. It's also compounded by the fact that high jump and glide are optional in Kingdom Hearts 2, instead of learning them as the main game goes on. And even though this is fixed to an extent with the stickers and the Cavern of Remembrance in the final mix version, it's still a huge loss when compared to the original. Unlike the original though, there are a lot more minigames this time around, and 2 minigame worlds instead of 1, and one that could have been cut specifically. Light cycles, present making, skateboarding, struggle matches, lots to do. It's fine for the main story, except for one optional minigame world in particular.
Darling, it's better down where it's wetter, take it from me.
Unless you want that ultimate weapon. However, for completionists for Jiminy's Journal, they're gonna get old really quickly. Go for it if you want to. Aside from the above mentioned, they put in a lot of small things that they didn't have to, but just made the game better overall. Like adding images to items, the command UI changing depending on what world you're in, the variety of costumes and appearances, the drive forms have different costumes, to even how Sora opens a log whether he's a lion cub or a manfish. It's all about the little things. Though combat is the star of the show, when we're talking about improvements, the Gummi Ships have to be mentioned. In the first game, I can only imagine that this was one of, if not the last thing to be implemented before being considered content complete before polish. It's slow, it's bare bones, not all that challenging. Some extra missions in the HD versions, and making your own Gummi Ship can be a time sink if that's your playstyle, but still. Then Kingdom Hearts 2 comes in and it's supercharged, much faster, much more intense, camera angle switching, less blocky on the enemy side of things, much more substantial rewards. Like Kingdom Hearts 1, the customization can sink hours out of a player, and if that's not your thing, there are templates for just playing the game. Personally speaking, I don't sink hours into the Gummi missions and just play it when it's necessary to continue the story, but I have to admit admiration for how many changes when looking at the two side by side. Objectively speaking, the first Kingdom Hearts is probably the better game of the two. More of its parts complement each other and felt much more tightly knit and put together. While in Kingdom Hearts 2, the combat, the bosses, the Gummi missions are vastly improved over the original, while the story drags at points and exploration is lessened. With all that said, I've played Kingdom Hearts 2 more than the first one, and I prefer Kingdom Hearts 2 when asked. And a big part of it was where I was back in early 2006. I just entered middle school, voice changing, and all the edgy teenage tropes that come years later. So, entering a new environment with new problems and puberty on the horizon, playing this game with all new worlds, new challenges, and Sora's voice actor and prolific child actor Haley Joel Osment also going through puberty at the time, made it especially personal.
How about a rematch sometime? Fair and square, no dark powers involved.
I'm sure there's some light in him somewhere.
It goes even further than that too. I remember going to cagevids.net, downloading and watching the unsubbed cutscenes and boss fights months before release.
アクセルも13機関なの?
And this in tandem was my first exposure to a foreign language, and the Japanese language specifically, which is eventually how I discovered YouTube. Granted, I would have found YouTube eventually, and led me to interests I still hold to this day. In many ways, this game was a pack of gateway drugs in my formative years. Kinda made me who I am, for better or for worse. But anyways, I'm obviously a biased voice in favor of this game, but if you like what you've seen or heard, check it out.